l'UN-CHK qui accueille ce matin ce symposium. Remercier la présence des autorités qui sont dans la salle. Wole Soyinka, le professeur Mamadou Diouf, un grand frère. Remercier la professeure Pr Babacar que je vois dans la salle. Tous les collègues aussi de l'université Diop et de l'université l'UN-CHK, les étudiants et les collègues.
First, I want to thank everybody that's here. I want to thank the Guggenheim Museum. I want to thank the Abu Dhabi, NYU Abu Dhabi. I want to thank Professor Wole Soyinka, Professor Mamadou Diouf, who is like a big brother from him, and Professor Pr Babacar, and the University UN-CHK for organizing these events.
Mon ami et grand frère Manka m'a piégé. Il m'a piégé parce qu'il ne m'avait pas dit que je devais communiquer sur le musée dynamique.
My friend Mantia Dara, he trapped me because he didn't tell me that I was supposed to talk about the Musée dynamique.
C'est quand le programme est sorti que j'ai vu que je devais parler du musée dynamique.
It's when I saw the program that I realized that I was supposed to talk about the Musée dynamique.
Mais c'est le grand frère, donc il est excusé.
But he's the big brother, so I have no choice. I'm going to do what he said.
Voilà, donc mon discours va porter sur le musée dynamique, bien sûr. Mais parler du musée dynamique, c'est aussi parler de Senghor.
I'm going to talk about the Musée dynamique, but talking about the Musée dynamique is also talking about Senghor.
Je suis très honoré ce matin de faire cette conférence inaugurale parce que vraiment, j'en suis honoré en présence d'autres qui pouvaient le faire à ma place.
I'm honored to be here because I'm doing these inaugural lessons, but there's many other people that could have done it in my place.
Léopold Sédar Senghor, dans son allocution à l'inauguration du musée dynamique, le 31 mars 1966, disait que le musée dynamique sera le vrai centre du premier festival mondial des arts nègres.
President Senghor was saying at the inauguration of the Musée dynamique that this museum would be the real center of African arts.
Il sera aussi le témoin dans l'avenir le plus signifiant.
It will also be like the most significant witness in the future.
Et jusqu'à sa première fermeture, parce que le musée dynamique a été, si vous voulez, créé en 1966 lors du Festival mondial des arts nègres. Il a été, si vous voulez, fermé plusieurs fois. Et jusqu'à sa première fermeture en 1977, le musée a accueilli de grandes expositions internationales, parmi lesquelles je peux citer l'exposition phare du premier Festival mondial des arts nègres, mais aussi de grands artistes du monde. Il y avait en 1970 des dessins de Léonard de Vinci exposés dans le musée dynamique.
The museum has welcomed a lot of people since its creation in 1966. It closed a lot, but reopened as well a lot of time. And it welcomed a lot of great exposition, among which I think you said Picasso?
Léonard de Vinci.
He also welcomed an exposition of Leonardo da Vinci.
Kandinsky et Miro ont exposé dans ce musée en 1970.
Kandinsky and also Miro exposed in 1970 in this museum.
Marc Chagall en 1971. Picasso en 1972.
Picasso in 1972.
Soulages en 1974. Soulages, Pierre Soulages.
No, Pierre Soulages in 1970.
Manessier en 1976.
1976, Manessier.
Et Ibn Ndiaye, le père de l'art contemporain sénégalais, aussi en 1977.
And the father of contemporary art in Senegal, Ibn Ndiaye, exposed in 1977 in that museum.
Même si chaque exposition, chacune de ces expositions-là présente un intérêt particulier, la question que je me pose, c'est qu'est-ce qui les lie? Qu'est-ce qui lie toutes ces expositions-là?
Although every single one of these expositions has a particular interest and particular focus, the question that he's asking is what links them together?
Senghor voulait-il approfondir ou rendre plus concrètes ses idées sur le dialogue et la rencontre des cultures?
Was it the fact that Senghor wanted to make more concrete his ideas of intercultural dialogue?
Si Senghor a décidé de fermer le musée après ces grandes expositions, je viens de citer, ces idées sur l'art et la négritude situées dans l'universalité sont-elles noyées au fil des expositions?
Senghor decided, although he decided to close the museum in 1977, they did at the same time make an end to his ideas of intercultural exchange.
Était-il à la hauteur de ses ambitions, Senghor?
Was Senghor had the means to his ambition by creating this museum?
Ce musée était-il une utopie dont Senghor aurait pris conscience?
Was it a utopic idea which Senghor realized at the end?
L'histoire de ce musée n'est pas que celle des expositions que je viens de citer, donc des expositions prestigieuses, mais aussi celle des réactions à cette expérience unique.
However, the story of this museum cannot be limited to the expositions. It's also, you have to also take into factor the reactions in that very unique factor that the museum put together.
Comment le public et les artistes ont vécu ces expositions, ces événements?
How did the artists and the public live these expositions and these events that happen in the museum?
Si l'enthousiasme de Senghor était bien connu, quel était celui du public sénégalais et des artistes sénégalais?
Although Senghor's enthusiasm about the museum was well known, the question is, what was it about the public and the artists in Senegal towards the museum?
Et ces grandes expositions au Sénégal confirment l'idée que le promoteur, Senghor, avait de la rencontre et du dialogue de culture.
The big exposition that the museum welcomed show and foreshow the idea that Senghor has about the intercultural exchange.
Et au-delà du musée imaginaire et universel dont parlait Malraux, Senghor avait mis en place un musée réel, un musée cosmopolite, sans frontières, qui accueillait les artistes et des visiteurs étrangers.
And beyond the imaginary museum that Malraux theorized, Senghor had made a reality of this museum by creating the Musée dynamique.
Car si ces artistes de renom ont franchi les portes ou les murs du musée dynamique, c'est nous dit Senghor, c'est qu'ils ont vécu, c'est Senghor qui parle, la rencontre des valeurs culturelles des différentes ethnies et nations au niveau de l'universel.
So if the artists that expose in this museum agreed to do that, according to Senghor, it's because those artists understand the importance of the cultural exchange and the meeting that needs to happen between different cultures and different countries.
Et les raisons donc pour lesquelles Senghor avait choisi d'exposer ou de faire exposer ces artistes, il y avait souvent, nous dit Senghor, des similitudes, des analogies ou des convergences entre l'œuvre de l'artiste et l'art nègre. Tout ce qu'exposait Picasso, Soulages, ces artistes comme Manessier, Senghor voyait tout le temps, donc à chaque fois, donc, si vous voulez, des similitudes, des convergences donc avec l'art nègre.
The reason why these artists exposed here, the reason why they were selected to expose here is because Senghor was seeing in these artists' work the similarities between what they were doing and African arts. And that's why they were allowed to expose in here.
Et donc, toutes ces expositions ou pratiques muséales en Afrique ont eu un héritage enraciné dans le colonialisme.
So all these expositions that happen in Africa, in the museum, have an origin in colonialism.
Et aujourd'hui encore, plus de 60 ans après les indépendances, les musées africains, des musées africains qui n'ont pas encore conscience, qui n'ont pas encore choisi une direction proprement africaine, continuent à exposer dans un militantisme occidental.
And up to today, museum that hasn't yet understand the importance of African arts continue to expose towards a colonial philosophy.
Et le président de l'ICOM, Alpha Omar Konaré, déclarait en 1991 déjà qu'il fallait tuer le musée occidental, en fait, qu'il fallait tuer le modèle occidental des musées.
The president of ICOM, which is Alpha Omar Konaré, was saying at some point that it was time to kill the museum that are made towards Western way of thinking.
Et donc, il nous invitait ainsi à réinventer le musée africain,
He's inviting us to reinvent the African museum,
à remettre en cause l'institution muséale héritée de l'époque coloniale.
to get rid or question the type of museum that we inherited from colonial.
Et l'histoire du musée dynamique nous permet de lire la décolonisation des musées africains et la question de la restitution du patrimoine africain exposé dans les musées occidentaux et sa présentation en Afrique.
The history of the Musée dynamique is giving us a chance to be able to think again about the return of African art, which is held right now in Western countries, and to think about how we could have a dynamic in African dynamic in our museum.
Je ne parlerai pas de l'exposition Art Nègre du premier festival mondial des arts nègres. Je ne parlerai pas non plus des expositions individuelles que je viens de citer, mais je parlerai plutôt de la politique muséale de Senghor dans un premier temps. Et dans un second temps, je vais essayer de montrer comment cette histoire du musée dynamique a permis de redéfinir, en tout cas nous permet de redéfinir les musées africains, et surtout sur la question très actuelle de la restitution.
I'm not going to talk about the exposition in 1966. I'm not talking either about the exposition of the artists that exposed, but what I want to talk about is how the creation of the Musée dynamique is going to allow us to rethink the whole philosophy of museum towards Africa.
Senghor est connu pour être un homme d'art et de culture, et pendant ses 20 années d'exercice au pouvoir, il a conçu, développé, il a promu une politique culturelle fondée sur donc l'idéologie de la négritude.
Senghor is a man of culture, and during the 20 years that he ruled over Senegal, he was a president of Senegal.
Il a conçu, développé et promu une politique culturelle fondée sur la négritude.
Exactly. So he conceived and developed and applied political culture that was based on his concept of négritude.
Il a accordé une place donc importante, une place privilégiée aux arts plastiques dans sa politique de développement de la nation.
Graphic art was an important part of his development policies in terms of culture.
Et grâce à lui, le Sénégal s'est fait remarquer dans les arts plastiques avec beaucoup d'institutions au Sénégal que je pourrais citer brièvement comme ça, les manufactures de Thiès, l'école des beaux-arts, le service donc d'archives culturelles, le musée dynamique, ainsi de suite. Mais surtout, donc Senghor a ainsi mis en place une scène artistique à part entière au Sénégal avec toutes ces institutions-là que je viens de citer.
Yeah, although his focus was on graphic art, on painting, because his focus was on painting, he created a lot of schools such as les tapisseries de Thiès and other institute that was created and that was focusing on painting. And because of that, Senegal was known around the world for the quality of his artists.
Et il fera de la négritude le critère de mécénat d'État durant tout son mandat. Les artistes devaient, si vous voulez, situer leur création conformément à ce qu'on appelait l'école de Dakar. Je parle en présence de Mamadou Diouf, qui connaît bien cette école de Dakar, et de Pendamba aussi. Donc Senghor fera de la négritude le critère de mécénat d'État durant tout son mandat, et les artistes devaient situer leur création conformément à ce qu'on appelait l'école de Dakar.
Senghor, however, during all his term in office, he, in order for an artist to be able to have the support of the government, this artist would have to take his art towards the concept of the négritude, yeah, to be able to focus on the concept of négritude, and that's the basis of what became l'école de Dakar, which is the school of Dakar, which was a specific school of painting.
C'est dans ce sens qu'il faut comprendre la création du musée dynamique.
And that's how you should understand the creation of Musée dynamique.
Où les arts plastiques occupent une place importante.
Painting is like probably one of the most important things in the Musée dynamique.
Avec l'invitation chaque année d'un artiste international.
And every year there was like an international artist that was invited to expose it.
La question de la fin des activités de ces musées nous appelle à replacer le projet dans le contexte de l'époque.
Yeah, the activities of the museum allow us to be able to get to focus the project in the context of the period where it was being done.
C'est Senghor lui-même qui ferme le musée pour la première fois en 1977.
Senghor himself closed down the museum for the first time in 1977.
Pour y installer la compagnie de danse Moudra Afrique.
And he transformed it into a dance company, which was called Moudra Afrique.
Le second président Abdou Diouf le ferme à nouveau en 90.
The second president of Senegal, Abdou Diouf, closed it again in 1990.
Après l'avoir donc rouvert en 82.
He reopened it in 82 and then closed it in 1990.
Pour y installer la Cour de cassation que vous connaissez maintenant.
And now it's like a tribunal.
C'est sur la corniche ouest, vous verrez la Cour de cassation. C'était ça, si vous voulez, le musée dynamique.
Yeah. So it's right here on the corniche, and now it's a court.
À sa réouverture en 82, jusqu'à sa fermeture définitive en 90, le musée dynamique a accueilli des expositions mémorables.
From its reopening in 1982 to its closing again in 1990, the museum welcomed a lot of important expositions.
J'ai cité les artistes occidentaux, mais les artistes africains aussi, il y en a eu beaucoup.
There was Westerners that came and exposed, but there was a lot of African artists as well.
Le musée a accueilli le premier salon national des artistes sénégalais en 85.
In 1985, the museum welcomed the first Salon des artistes africains.
Il a accueilli les arts vivants du Zaïre.
It welcomed les arts vivants du Zaïre.
Il a accueilli des artistes que nous connaissons tous, comme Alpha Wawali Diallo,
Artists like Alpha Wawali Diallo,
Jacob Yakuba,
Jacob.
Elle, de grands artistes aussi sénégalais qui ont exposé dans ce musée-là.
There's some other great Senegalese artists that expose in that museum as well.
Sur la réception de ces expositions par les Sénégalais, en général.
The question of how the Senegalese welcome these expositions.
Certains témoins de l'époque que j'ai rencontrés,
some of the people from that time that I met,
comme Pendambao, Alioune Badiane, Raphaël Ndiaye, qui vient de nous quitter il y a 1 an ou 2 ans à peu près.
Like Professor Pendambao,
Alioune Badiane. Je te les ai rencontrés et donc, par exemple, ces personnalités-là, je donne l'exemple, par exemple, de Raphaël Ndiaye, qui est l'ancien directeur de la Fondation Senghor, qui est décédé maintenant, pense que ces expositions-là étaient bien suivies par la population.
According to these people, specifically Mr. Raphaël Ndiaye, they think that these expositions was very well welcomed by the population.
Alors que d'autres, comme Alioune Badiane et Pendambao,
some other people like Pendambao and Alioune Badiane,
pour eux, l'engouement des Sénégalais était en général très limité.
For them, they didn't think that the people really welcomed it. It was very limited.
Dans un entretien que j'ai eu avec Raphaël, il dit ceci: j'ai régulièrement visité ces expositions au musée dynamique. C'était de grandes manifestations bien suivies, car la culture était la ligne directrice de la politique de Senghor.
So in an interview he did with Raphaël, Raphaël was saying that he visited the museum and the exposition, and he sees that the people was following it because he feels like culture was something that was very important in Senegal at the time of Senghor.
Mais quelqu'un pour Alioune Badiane, qui a connu cette époque aussi, dit ceci: l'intérêt de ces expositions-là était limité à l'élite. C'est lui qui parle, à l'élite, aux amis de Senghor, à l'assistance et aux artistes qui allaient alimenter les expositions.
So, but when you talk to somebody else like Alioune Badiane, he says that the interest in this exposition was only limited to what he called the elite, the upper class, Senghor friends, and that's it.
Et Pendambao dit ceci, je la cite aussi: les élèves de Dakar que nous étions avaient beaucoup de chance, car ils étaient initiés très jeunes à l'esthétique négro-africaine.
Pendambao, who is here, told him that the students of Dakar at that time was very lucky because very early they was introduced to arts.
L'élite accordait une grande place à la culture, aux arts et aux lettres, puisque Senghor les plaçait au devant de son action, au cœur donc de son action.
If I can say, the upper class of the society was very attracted to art, gave a lot of importance to art because Senghor gave a lot of importance to art. So,
mais le reste de la population maintenant, des Sénégalais, sans comprendre véritablement le sens de ces expositions, étaient habitués à entendre certains grands noms d'artistes à travers les discours de Senghor et les accueils réservés à ces personnalités-là. Je continue toujours de citer Pr Babacar.
Still following what, still on Pr Babacar, what she says is that, although there was that, but the general population, which might not have understood what was going on, but however, they know about these names, these artists, because they used to hear them in Senghor speeches.
La question aussi que je me pose, mais au fond, l'homme sénégalais suisse que Senghor voulait, si vous voulez, façonner, avait-il les moyens de faire de l'art et de la culture des valeurs essentielles?
Well, the big question is like the Homo Senegalensis that Senghor wanted to create. Did he have the means to be able to follow the exposition and the arts? Like,
le programme de politique culturelle et artistique de Senghor, on le sait, était confronté à d'énormes, si vous voulez, à des problématiques sociales et économiques qui préoccupaient plus les Sénégalais.
The program of Senghor in terms of cultural policy was facing real difficulties, which was like the difficulties of being able to survive in this society, which was what the society wanted to be.
Et sa politique culturelle était qualifiée par ses opposants d'extravertis et d'élitistes.
The political opponents of Senghor used to qualify his cultural politics as something that's being.
Il était même accusé par ses opposants d'utiliser les deniers publics pour organiser des événements culturels au lieu de résoudre les problèmes socio-économiques auxquels le pays était confronté à l'époque.
Opposition used to tell him that he would take the money of the people to organize cultural events instead of taking care of some other more important necessities, according to them.
Et c'est peut-être dans ce sens qu'il faut comprendre, en tout cas qu'il faut comprendre et situer la fermeture du musée dynamique.
That's probably what led to the closing of the Musée dynamique.
Aujourd'hui, on serait tenté de dire qu'il ne reste pas grand-chose de ces expositions prestigieuses.
Today, we can say that there's not much left of these.
La Cour de cassation est toujours logée au musée dynamique.
The court is still in the Musée dynamique.
Et sa restitution à la culture n'est pas à l'ordre du jour.
And giving it back to culture is not even like something that we talk about right now. It's not even.
Mais pour Senghor, l'indépendance économique et politique ne peut se faire sans une indépendance culturelle.
But according to Senghor, independence, economic independence or political independence cannot happen without a cultural independence.
Ainsi, Senghor était convaincu que la résolution des problèmes économiques et politiques passe d'abord par la résolution des problèmes culturels.
Senghor was convinced that to resolve the economic and political problems, you have to resolve the cultural problem first.
Le vœu de Senghor, je l'ai dit et répété, était d'organiser chaque année une exposition avec un artiste international. C'était un peu l'âge d'or des arts plastiques sénégalais à l'époque.
Senghor's wish was that they should be a big major exposition from an international artist and from Senegalese artists every year in the Musée dynamique.
Aujourd'hui, il est triste de voir que l'État n'est plus investisseur dans les arts au Sénégal. Il n'y a plus malheureusement d'exposition d'envergure que je viens de citer au début, les Picasso, les Soulages. Il n'y a plus ces expositions-là aujourd'hui et c'est un peu dommage quand on... mais bon, la Biennale est encore là aussi qui peut peut-être remplacer, mais ce n'est pas du tout la même chose à mon avis.
So today there's no more investment in art and culture in Senegal. There's no major museum, there's no major exposition. The only thing that's left is Biennale, but it's...
Bon, je m'arrête juste là sur la politique muséale de Senghor pour finir mon propos sur la deuxième partie de mon propos. Donc, la question de la restitution du patrimoine africain et de la décolonisation des musées.
The second part is about the question of the restitution of our patrimoine and decolonizing the museums.
La politique muséale africaine doit être pensée en termes de bifurcation.
Crossing?
Yes, I think it's bifurcation. Bifurcation.
So basically, you should think about the policy of the museum in Africa should be thought in terms of bifurcation.
Aujourd'hui, il est temps de quitter le mimétisme occidental et de choisir une direction proprement africaine.
It's time for us to turn away from imitating the Western world, but to tread our own path.
Nous ne pouvons plus envisager les musées africains modernes à partir de la colonisation.
We cannot think about the modern museum within the framework of colonization.
C'est avec donc une éducation muséale construite sur la base de récits africains, de récits ou, si vous voulez, d'imaginaire africain, qu'il sera possible de décoloniser la muséologie en Afrique.
It is with a new thinking and with a new path that we can reimagine the museum in Africa with an African way of thinking.
Il s'agit de rompre avec l'idéologie occidentale d'une muséologie unique, commune et universelle.
We need to get rid of the Western ideology and come up with a new ideology that is unique and universal at the same time.
Et avec la muséologie décoloniale, il ne s'agit plus d'étudier les communautés africaines, mais de déconstruire l'idée coloniale et occidentale des musées, de renverser la manière de faire un musée, d'acquérir et d'exposer des collections.
And so with the new way of thinking, it is going to be about thinking about museum in a different way and acquire new thinking in African thinking in museum.
Et donc, il s'agit pour les muséologues africains de décider eux-mêmes de comment ils veulent représenter un musée et ses collections.
African professional in museum needs to be thinking themselves how they want to see the museum.
Mais ce processus décolonial passe d'abord et avant tout par le rapatriement des objets, par la restitution du patrimoine artistique et culturel africain qui sont dans les galeries et musées occidentaux.
Its process of thinking goes, it's important. It starts with the restitution of all the work of arts that are African work of arts that are right now in Western museums.
Et aujourd'hui, la question de la restitution du patrimoine africain dans les musées occidentaux devrait inciter l'État sénégalais et même les États africains en général à repenser leur politique muséographique pour pouvoir accueillir ces objets restitués et les intégrer dans une nouvelle configuration.
And the debate on the restitution should influence our governments, whether it's Senegal or other countries in Africa, to rethink their museum policies in order for them to be able to welcome those work of arts that are supposed to come back.
Et même si Senghor n'avait pas envisagé cette question de restitution,
even though Senghor didn't talk about the question of the restitution,
je pense qu'il avait bien réfléchi sur la circulation des objets.
But he thought about the way the arts objects travel around the world.
Et c'est d'ailleurs la raison pour laquelle il avait mis en place cette exposition itinérante d'art contemporain sénégalais à l'étranger.
That's probably why he put together a traveling exposition. It's a traveling Senegalese contemporary art exposition that he put together that travel around the world.
Et cette exposition a parcouru le monde.
It went around the world, yeah.
Cette possibilité de circulation des objets et d'échange permet de restituer non seulement les objets, mais aussi les traductions. Là, je cite un mot très cher au professeur Bachir Diagne. Donc, cette possibilité de circulation et d'échange, si vous voulez, nous permet de restituer non seulement les objets, mais aussi les traductions.
Okay. The restitution, but also the traveling of arts will allow us not only to bring back our works, but also to exchange and to expose our own cultural way of thinking around the world.
Ces objets n'ont pas été seulement déplacés de l'Afrique à l'Occident, ils ont été aussi transplantés, pour reprendre aussi un mot de Bachir Diagne.
So these objects weren't just taken from Africa and moved to the Western world. They were also, to use the words of Suleiman Bachir Diagne, they were transplanted.
Partis avec leur propre langue, ces objets sont partis avec leur propre langue, ils vont retourner dans leur terre d'origine avec des langues d'autres cultures.
So, because these objects left their countries with their own languages, and when they will come back with a language of another culture.
Le transfert dans les galeries et les musées occidentaux, là aussi je reprends une expression de Bachir Diagne, fut ainsi une transplantation, une traduction et une translation.
Okay, their transfer into the Western Museum was not only a transfer, but it was also a transplantation and
The translation, traduction.
a translation, a traduction, a translation.
Translation.
Yeah.
Ce sont ces objets africains qui vont être rapatriés ou restitués que Souleymane Bachir Diagne attribue le nom de mutants.
Those objects that are going to be brought back are the objects that Souleymane Bachir Diagne called the mutants.
Récemment, il a fait une sortie très polémique sur quand il a dit que ces objets au Louvre sont à leur place, sont dans leur place. Ça a été très polémique. Il n'y a pas une semaine, il l'a dit. Ça a créé, en tout cas au niveau, beaucoup de bruit.
Les objets sont à leur place. Okay.
Ouais,
So,
les objets africains qui sont au musée sont à leur place. C'est ce qu'il a dit récemment.
So recently, Professor Souleymane Bachir Diagne says something like that. He says that the objects that are in the Museum of the Louvre are in their place. So
mais ce qu'il faut dire, et je finis par là, c'est que ces objets exposés dans les musées, ce qu'il veut dire par là, c'est que simplement ces objets sont des objets mutants. Et il appelle, il attribue ces objets le nom de mutant, le nom de mutation et même le nom de transmutation.
So, but what he was trying to, although what he says create a lot of polemics, but what he was trying to say is that those objects are mutants. They're not what they used to be. They transform now. They're mutants.
Et donc, ces objets sont chargés de nouvelles significations. Et les restituer signifie aussi de les déraciner à nouveau.
So those objects, since they've been there, they have a new signification. And now to restore, to bring them back in Africa, is another way of also transplanting them because
et pour Bachir donc, ces objets sont finalement comme des rhizomes, poussés des racines ailleurs et ils appartiennent à plusieurs terres.
So these objects are like they grow roots in other places, and so now they belong to many different lands and many different cultures, according to Souleymane.
Mais cette idée de musée des mutants, de Souleymane Bachir Diagne n'est pas très loin de l'idée du musée dynamique de Senghor.
This idea of the Museum of Mutants, which is what the concept of Souleymane Bachir Diagne, if you consider these works of art that are coming back as mutant, is not very far away from the idea of Senghor with the Musée dynamique.
Le mot dynamis signifie en grec la puissance.
The word dynamis in Greek signifies strength.
La force.
Power, strength.
Par conséquent, les objets et les tableaux d'art qui sont exposés au musée dynamique sont des objets mutants, mieux sont des objets migrants, des objets migratoires.
So the objects that are exposed in the Musée dynamique and the other music are objects that are mutants, that are objects that are migrating.
Senghor avait donc une vision très dynamique de l'art africain.
So Senghor had a very dynamic vision of African arts.
Je conclus.
In conclusion,
créé pour les besoins donc, du Festival mondial des arts nègres, le Musée dynamique a été pendant une décennie une vitrine de l'art moderne et contemporain dans des expositions clés de grands artistes qui ont marqué le XXe siècle.
Created within the first international Black Art Festival in Senegal, the museum, since its creation, has been promoting Black arts.
Le musée a connu une histoire tumultueuse et passionnante avec toutes ces fermetures que vous connaissez.
Its history through time was very it has a lot of movements because it opens and closes a lot.
Comme dans beaucoup de musées africains, ces différentes expositions du musée dynamique ont été élaborées dans un contexte de l'héritage de la muséologie occidentale.
Just like most of the African museum, the exposition in the Musée dynamique was thought through the prism of Western museum.
Aujourd'hui, avec la question très actuelle de la restitution du patrimoine africain, l'avenir des musées d'Afrique passe par de nouveaux modèles de muséologie proprement africains.
Today, with the question of the restitution, the future of African museum has to be through a new model, a new prism of how we're going to do it.
En Afrique de l'Ouest, à part quelques exceptions près, les musées, dont la plupart sont issus des musées coloniaux, ont du mal à drainer des populations.
In West Africa, in pretty much all of West African countries, the museums, which are like museum made according to the Western way of making museum, they have a hard time attracting people.
Il est grand temps, pour reprendre donc l'idée de Konaré, de tuer le modèle occidental du musée en Afrique pour que s'épanouissent de nouveaux modèles de conservation et de promotion du patrimoine africain.
It's high time, according to take again the words of Mr. Konare, to kill the museum model of the Western world that we have here and to start with a new model of museum that is more in tune with our culture.
Il s'agit donc de réinventer et de redéfinir le musée africain.
We have to reinvent and redefine the African museum.
Et cela revient à les inscrire dans un imaginaire africain.
And in order to do that, we have to put them into the African imagination.
Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you. A bad translation.
Merci. Vous n'avez pas mis votre son? Ah. S'il vous plaît. I'll put it on the table.
Awam prefer to be placed, and Victor, they have exchanged. Victor is going to take Awam and pass place. Because he feels that you are more familiar with the topic. And then Nicole Lapierre also wants.
The white woman.
Yeah, so please.
Yes.
Okay.
Et voilà le deuxième.
Okay. Il y a peur de mettre sur la table, ça va gronder encore.
Je suis assise ici, j'ai des signes avec 10 minutes, 5 minutes et la fin de la conversation.
Ok. Et après, le professeur monte.
Exactement.
Okay. So, you want to start at the Victor. You want to be the first to respond, or?
Oh no, I wait. This was an emergency, so let me hear what people are saying first.
Okay. There's something there.
Yeah. Where's yeah. So when is
You start. Okay. To all kind of politics, let me just see if I can get, nobody wants to start first. Let me see if I can get it going. Okay. Let me put this away. Tell. Est-ce que Vieux Diva est là, mon ami Vieux Diva? Tu es sur ce panel. Voilà. So while he's coming, let me put this here. I think Babacar Mbaye reference to Senghor is voilà. Reference to Léopold Sédar Senghor is very apt. And I think more importantly, through the valorization of place. And I have been talking about this for some time now, taking it out of Edouard Glissant, who always say in French, agis dans ton lieu et pense avec le monde, which is very important. Agis dans ton lieu et pense avec le monde. And what he meant by this is that your place is important and you have to fight for your place. You need to fight for your place, but it is wrong to close your place. A closed totality is meant to die. So your totality has to be always open to the world. You have to think with the world for two reasons for Glissant. Again, taking from this talk here. First, when you fight to define your place, you have to realize that through that struggle, you have developed a creativity that can travel to somebody else's country. And no matter how small your place is, your place has a power to transform the world. So don't ever underestimate your place for that reason. Don't underestimate your place for the other reason that, I don't know why I'm having the echoes. So, oui, quand je mets le mic, ah voilà, c'est mieux maintenant, okay. So we're talking about place on the one hand, fight for your place. Your place is very important, but don't close your place off. You have to always think with the world. And you're not thinking with the world because only the world is gonna come and influence you and put ideas in your head or denaturalize you or destroy you. But you're thinking with the world because your place has the power to change the world, no matter how small your place is. And I think that was very much Senghorian. That's what I was getting out of your talk. Who want to pick it up from there? I'm moderating. I just wanted to start first to get us going.
I don't want to, but I can.
Marie-Hélène Pereira at
I will do.
the House of World Cultures in Berlin.
Oui. Parce que ouais, je suis dakaroise, donc je peux pas venir à Dakar et parler anglais. C'est pas logique pour moi. Mais oui, je m'appelle Marie-Hélène Pereira et je suis commissaire d'exposition. J'ai commencé ma pratique curatoriale ici, à Dakar, à Raw Material Company, que je pense que la plupart des gens vont connaître ici. Un centre pour l'art, le savoir et la société. Et toute ma réflexion curatoriale a été engendrée par cette idée de réfléchir en connexion. Donc l'art en connexion à la société, l'art en connexion avec les différentes formes de savoir que revêtent nos sociétés. Donc je pense que déjà ça, pour moi, c'était un bon point de départ. Aujourd'hui, à la Maison des Cultures du Monde, à Berlin, je continue ma pratique curatoriale. Et là-bas, en équipe, on a beaucoup réfléchi à ce que ça signifie que d'être une Maison des Cultures du Monde. Ce qui est bien sûr une grosse responsabilité. Comment est-ce qu'on peut avoir la prétention d'être l'institution qui représente les cultures du monde? Donc, quand on a commencé à travailler là, pour nous, il était important de décortiquer tout ça un peu. Et, OK. En anglais, c'est House of World Cultures. Donc, on a commencé à réfléchir sur ce que ça signifie que d'être une maison, a house. Et comment est-ce qu'on peut plutôt créer a home? Parce qu'en anglais, le français utilise juste la maison, mais en anglais, the house and the home are two different things. Donc, on a commencé à réfléchir à cette idée de home, pensant à la convivialité, à l'hospitalité et la manière dont on doit recevoir des savoirs du monde. Et aussi la manière dont on devrait réfléchir à la multitude, aux multiples mondes qui existent. Le monde de l'humain, le monde des êtres vivants, qui ne sont pas humains, mais qui sont des êtres, les animaux, les plantes, la terre et tout ça. Donc, pour nous, il était important de décortiquer tous ces aspects-là, surtout sachant que cette institution a été créée pendant la guerre froide en 1956 et était un don des États-Unis à l'Allemagne de l'Ouest. Elle a existé comme maison de congrès jusqu'en 1988 où elle a été transformée en maison des cultures du monde. Donc, il y a tout un héritage politique qui est là, avec quoi il fallait travailler depuis les années 80 jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Donc, pour nous, la question de la réparation est une question centrale dans le travail qu'on fait. Donc, comment est-ce que la Maison des cultures du monde aujourd'hui travaille de manière effective pour une réparation qui, je pense, ne peut pas être atteinte à 100%, c'est juste pas possible, mais on peut s'engager à faire un travail réparatoire tous les jours. Donc, c'est ce qu'on a implémenté. Et oui, ça prend plusieurs formes, différents types de programmation. Une chose qui est importante à dire ici, c'est que nous ne sommes pas un musée. Et je dis souvent, thank God, que nous ne soyons pas un musée. La Maison des cultures du monde n'a pas de collection. Donc, tout ce qui nous intéresse est lié vraiment à l'héritage immatériel. Et la plupart du temps, quand on parle de restitution, je pense souvent qu'on oublie de parler de restitution quand il s'agit d'héritage immatériel. Tous les sujets, on les appelle au lieu d'objets parce qu'ils ont, voilà, ils ont eu une vie, ils ont une importance. Tous ces sujets qui existent dans les musées occidentaux aujourd'hui sont là enfermés, mais on n'a pas idée de l'ampleur de l'absence d'héritage immatériel que ça a engendré. Donc, parfois, on parle même de la restitution, on se limite à l'objet qui est là, qui réside dans le musée, qui doit être retourné, etc. Ce qui est bien sûr primordial. La restitution doit être effective, elle doit être faite. Mais est-ce qu'on peut réfléchir à l'héritage immatériel? Qu'est-ce qui est perdu vraiment, au-delà de l'objet physique? Donc, toute une réflexion autour oui, des savoirs qui sont liés à nos langues traditionnelles, par exemple, nos systèmes d'éducation. Voilà, quelles sont les références qu'on veut mettre en avant dans une maison des cultures du monde? Et le dernier point, je pense, pour le moment, c'est qu'on a beaucoup suivi dans les communautés indigènes d'Amérique du Nord, surtout les communautés Anishinaabe, donc en fait toutes les communautés de ce qu'on appelle le Turtle Island, surtout les communautés féminines, ont mis en avant ce concept de rematriation, qui pour eux est une urgence de penser la restitution hors de l'illusion décoloniale des institutions qui sont calquées sur le modèle occidental. Donc pour eux, on doit parler de rématriation pour elles. Et la rématriation, c'est le moyen qu'on a pour rétablir un équilibre de vie dans le monde dans lequel nous vivons. Et ce processus de rématriation est un processus qui est pensé autour de l'idée de retourner tous ces sujets dans le sein féminin, qui est le premier espace d'humanité, en réalité. Donc, toute la réflexion tourne autour de cette idée-là, de réfléchir à comment est-ce qu'il faut accueillir tous ces sujets qui résident en Occident, qui sont captivés, voilà, captured, sorry, en Occident. Donc, comment est-ce qu'on peut penser la restitution, la réparation, la rématriation, mais de la perspective des communautés qui sont celles qui ont été qui ont perdu quelque chose, au fait, de très important et qui ont besoin de cette restitution-là aujourd'hui.
Merci beaucoup. Okay, you got the idea is do need to summarize what she's been saying. The words that stayed with me would be home, repatriation. That word stayed with me. And then, and by repatriation, it's like a return to the womb. And then another word was reparation, repatriation, and then restitution. Those words stayed with me in the presentation for the Anglophone Wolofophones in this case. Okay, good. Yeah, you go ahead.
Thank you. I think I would like to start with a proverb. We usually would say an African proverb. You know, Africa, but different. It's not actually every time a mask that is carved from a wood have the opportunity to sit at the base of that wood. By that, I mean,
Speak a little. Combien de personnes demandent une traduction dans la salle? No, okay. So just speak louder.
okay. What I'm trying to say is that it's not every time that a wooden mask that is carved has the opportunity to sit at the base of the tree from where that branch was carved from. By saying that, I would like to honor the presence of Professor Wole Soyinka here. We start from there because there are certain things that we have to start from. I've been consuming his work since I was a teenager. So it's an opportunity to have him in the audience. And the other thing is when an elder sends you a message, you can then send somebody else, which is why I'm sitting here when Awam sent me this message. This was not my panel, so you have to excuse me. But when we are talking about what is museum in the first place, because we often have to like actually look at that. We have to deconstruct that word. What is museum? You know, so because when we use that word from a Western perspective, some Westerners or Africans might even think that we didn't have museums, but we didn't call them museums. I grew up in a village where we have shrines, where we have walls, where we have architecture. We didn't have to put alarm around masks so that you don't have to touch them. You know what to touch, you know what to get close to, and you know where to stay away from. Also, the word installation is not new to us. In the sense that if you also grew up in the village, you realize that after time, there are those that are ephemeral installations and those that are permanent installations. What we call altars and shrines are commemorative places for us, and they are not ordinary. They are decorative. There are things that you cannot see in different altars. You can't see a plastic in an Ogun shrine. You cannot see a black cloth in Oshun shrine. You know, so we have our way of curating as well. But because of that colonial incursion into our culture, we began to kind of align with that because that was what was given to us. I am an artist. I didn't go to any art school. I actually studied English and literature, but I have been an artist all my life, surrounded by art in the community, helping in building houses with what they are now calling rammed earth. I mean, if you grew up in the village, then you come to the West, you start seeing English that have been spoken, and you begin to look at it like, but this is what we do, you know? So, and also, how do we begin to look at our art again without actually thinking that we have always art for art's sake? We do have art for art's sake. I mean, the things that we use in drinking, the vessels that we use in drinking, presenting cola nuts or palm wine, those were art for art's sake, but those are not the utilitarian art that kind of drive what we could call African art and the way we begin to look at African museology, because a lot of these things, as we have seen from Faustine's presentation, you realize that they are not art for art's sake. And if we begin to look at it from that perspective, we are not going to start from even the curators that have already studied. How do you begin to reorient the curators? Because there are those that will stand on the other side like, no, we are going to stand on Western ways of looking at objects, or Western ways of looking at paintings, or Western ways of looking at other form of art that is coming out from the continent. But you have to realize that we've never run away from duality. Africans have never run away from duality. We have what they call multiple intelligence, and I happen to read about the Oshogbo School, for instance, whereby you didn't have to have an MFA. What you could call local apprentice has always been there. So after a while, the universities begin to like say, oh, you don't have a PhD, you can't teach. But, you know, when we begin to like other ourselves in that way, how do we first of all even stop that before we start talking about decolonization? Because or returning to a different kind of museum. So we need to clean our plates first before we start putting foods in them. On that sense, I will hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Merci Macha. Je voudrais d'abord remercier ceux qui ont organisé cette magnifique rencontre, qui est un prétexte formidable pour parler d'une question d'une grande importance. Je voudrais d'abord raconter une petite anecdote. J'ai vécu en 2007, j'étais à la Documenta et on nous a amené pour promener à Berlin. En ce moment, le doyen Wole Soyinka devait faire une conférence là-bas. Alors, j'avais une barbe hein, comme lui. Les gens ne connaissant pas, on me dit, are you Wole Soyinka? Donc, c'est pour dire que j'ai une grande fascination pour lui à travers sa célèbre formule, le tigre ne proclame pas sa tigritude, il brandit. C'est cet aspect opérationnel de la question muséale. Moi, je suis artiste. J'ai beaucoup travaillé sur les questions de patrimoine dans mon art de recherche artistique. J'ai actuellement créé un espace qui s'appelle Manifa, la Maison des cultures contemporaines, qui travaille sur comment le fait culturel peut devenir un fait approprié par les populations. Parce que jusqu'à quand le processus de fabrication du discours muséal, il y a un processus de fabrication du discours muséal pour lui donner à des objets, à des situations, à des concepts, la dignité d'objets muséal ou de situation muséale. Nous avions été confrontés il y a quelques années, quand on est à la conférence des préfigurations du Musée des civilisations noires. J'avais dit à l'époque, ce musée des civilisations noires ne peut pas être un musée d'art classique. Il ne peut pas être non plus un musée contemporain qu'on connaît. C'est quoi donc son objet? Et ça, c'est très important parce que le musée, c'est d'abord, si on parle d'œuvre d'art, l'objet matériel qui est fabriqué par une technique, une manière de faire avec des matériaux qui ont des process de fabrication, qui sont des savoir-faire technologiques, qui appartiennent à des populations. Mais au-delà de ça, il y a l'immatériel des objets. Et si on met des objets qui sont créés dans des concepts de fusion entre l'immatériel et la technologie de fabrication, qui appartiennent à des peuples maîtrisés, et qui les ont mis dans des contextes sociologiques et anthropologiques qu'on connaît, on les appelle, on les met dans d'autres contextes. Au départ, on disait que ces objets sont des objets sataniques pour vous, dans le processus de christianisation. C'est pas bon pour vous. Et ça, ces objets se sont retrouvés dans d'autres contextes. Et d'autres discours ont été fabriqués à partir de ces objets. Et ces discours ont permis à l'Occident de se développer et de construire un discours universaliste à partir de ces expériences de jonction. Mais le problème, pour moi, je l'ai dit plusieurs fois, ces œuvres où ces situations étaient dans des circonstances qu'on connaît très bien. Les sociétés africaines, c'est les sociétés de performance, où l'objet d'art est un élément d'une société dans son fonctionnement, à la fois matériel et immatériel. Toute la structure sociologique et sociale est construite à partir de ces expériences de vie. Alors, les objets qui sont cachés dans des greniers, est-ce que le grenier est au musée, un espace de conservation? Si on prend ces objets, on les amène en Occident dans des musées avec une architecture, des fois qui n'ont aucun rapport avec la structure de ces objets d'art, il y a un premier problème de l'objet et son environnement immédiat. C'est devenu finalement des objets de curiosité qui est une espèce d'handicap. Ces objets sont handicapés en réalité. Aujourd'hui, on décide de les restituer. Je disais il y a quelques années, faisant partie de tout un processus économique de construction d'une société avec un certain nombre de rapports à l'économie, à la société. Et ces objets sont partis en Occident en sont d'objets, des prétextes de spéculation monétaire, ont pris de la valeur de l'autre côté. Les sociétés laissées en Afrique, entre-temps, ont évolué. Ils sont évolués. Ils sont partis d'une société avec des pratiques, des relations de la société, et ils sont devenus des sociétés de consommation comme tout le monde. Imaginons qu'on restitue, on dit restituer. Restitution, c'est un mot qui a un sens, ça veut dire ramener là où vous avez pris. Est-ce qu'on va restituer ces œuvres dans les greniers? C'est la question. Je pense que ça va être difficile. Et si, par hasard, on les amenait dans des greniers, entre-temps, ces bas-miliqués sont devenus des consommateurs comme tout le monde. Ils veulent les dernières marques, ils veulent iPhone, ils veulent, voilà. Et ils ont faim, ils ont besoin d'argent. Cet objet qui est retourné dans le grenier vaut des millions de dollars. Et les gars savent que l'objet-là vaut maintenant des millions de dollars. Qu'est-ce qui va se passer? Un autre système va s'organiser. Et ces œuvres vont retourner encore parce que finalement, c'est l'argent, la dimension monétaire du problème est une dimension à intégrer dans la problématique des musées aujourd'hui. Qu'est-ce qui va se passer? Un autre circuit va s'organiser. Mais aussi aujourd'hui, si on retourne des objets, on les met dans des bâtiments à Dakar, avec des vitres. On n'a pas restitué, on a délocalisé. Je crois que c'est différent. La question de la restitution est différente de la question de la délocalisation. Parce que le rapport au public ne change pas. C'est les mêmes personnes qui vont se déplacer à Dakar, regarder des objets isolés toujours de leur origine. C'est là où interviennent nous, artistes. Parce que en 2010, Ablaye, si mes souvenirs sont bons, quand on organisait Prête-moi ton rêve au musée de Tunkara à Djemé, un journaliste m'a interpellé de mais ce musée est dans un quartier populaire, les populations ont d'autres problèmes. Je lui ai dit justement, la question de la géographie des musées, c'est où on doit construire ces musées, c'est important, mais ça ne suffit pas. Parce que il faut d'abord, je l'ai dit, en fait, ce qui se passe aujourd'hui, c'est que si on paie ces musées-là et on met des objets d'art dans des contextes géographiques que nous connaissons aujourd'hui, il faut parallèlement développer un nouveau type de médiation entre ces objets d'art et les populations. Parce que ce n'est pas ces populations qui vont venir, compte tenu des questions économiques, vers ces objets d'art. Que faire? C'est là où la question de la médiation et le rôle des artistes paraît très important dans ce processus d'appropriation. Il y a quelques années, il y a un projet initié par les Allemands qui s'appelle Réimaginer le passé. Beaucoup d'artistes, y compris moi-même, on est entré en immersion dans les musées et nous en sommes inspirés et nous avons créé des œuvres contemporaines. Ça, c'est une manière de restitution. Mais ça ne se limite pas à ce niveau. Ces œuvres, si elles rentrent dans des contextes architecturaux qu'on connaît, doivent nous apprendre à organiser une économie parallèle. Parce qu'en fait, les œuvres classiques avaient une économie parallèle. Quelle est la nouvelle économie qu'on va créer à partir du retour de ces œuvres? Parce que le problème, ce n'est pas de la théorie. On a beaucoup théorisé sur ces œuvres d'art. On n'a pas pensé à la dimension opérationnelle de ces objets par rapport à la problématique d'instaurer une économie réelle qui va réconcilier ces œuvres d'art avec les populations. Et je crois que c'est ça, c'est la vraie réflexion pour moi, l'appropriation des questions des musées, c'est ça. À partir de ce moment, nous devons construire autrement, nous devons nous habiller autrement, nous devons aménager nos espaces intérieurs autrement, en permettant aux designers, aux architectes, aux artistes d'aller puiser les éléments de liaison entre l'économie de ces populations, la projection de la nouvelle économie qui est une économie qui se base sur l'identité, sur l'appropriation de notre patrimoine pour en faire une notion dynamique du musée. Sinon, le musée va être un projet très lointain des populations. Les populations ont un problème de révolution économique. Je crois que dans la révolution économique, c'est là où on attend, à mon avis, les musées, et le concept doit être un concept opérationnel. Alors, en 2018, j'étais commissaire du pavillon Sénégal. Simon Diamy avait un sujet en faisant allusion, en extrait d'un poème de Émile Césaire, Le Rouge, le temps de l'action. Je lui ai dit dans mon texte curatorial qu'au fond, le problème, l'action n'a jamais manqué. Mais quelle action? C'est là où il y a problème. Senghor a posé des actes. Tout le monde sait. Mais malgré ça, hélas, on est dans quelle situation? C'est ça le problème. Je l'ai dit qu'au fond, et moi j'ai organisé ma démarche curatoriale, c'est quelque chose que j'appelle la brèche. Et une brèche demande à être restaurée. Quand on restaure une matière agressée par une autre matière de l'extérieur, la réparation montre qu'on doit trouver les éléments capables d'opérer cette opération-là. Et c'est pourquoi la question du retour de ces œuvres, la définition de nouveaux concepts de musée, doit nous permettre de réfléchir sur qu'est-ce qui va permettre que cette problématique-là prenne entre ce qui est la réalité et ce qui manque aux populations africaines à travers cet outil pédagogique formidable. Les musées doivent être considérés comme des espaces pédagogiques, d'éducation, de formation et de promotion d'une nouvelle problématique existentielle dans nos pays respectifs. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. My French isn't good enough to speak in French. I did understand most of it. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation, and Naylen for what you said. So I think it's good that you gave me the last speech, because I think the reason we're here as an institution who is built in Abu Dhabi in cooperation with a very large-scale Western museum, we're trying to reinvent is really, I think, to think about what are the methods to achieve, when we speak about the new museum for the 21st century, and in which way can a Guggenheim Abu Dhabi be part of that, and what do we need to learn? And I think that's the starting point for this institution, to say that it's based on a very generous invitation of a place like Abu Dhabi to invite a large-scale American institution to come and join and partner on it on a very kind of equal level, and build a new museum with a large-scale collection, but having the opportunity to really rethink what are the seeds for an institution to achieve something in a place which is very unique, because it's a place which doesn't have one large community. It has many, many communities. And I think that allows us to ask this question, how can we serve these many communities, and how can we make sure that what we do is really embracing that? And I think what you spoke about, you know, the African museum or the non-Western museum, but also the question is, what can be a museum which is not the museum just of one place, but it's kind of, it's of one place, but it's for many communities. And I think when we go to all the different texts we're referencing, from Wole Soyinka's text or Edouard Lisson, but also a book, which I think is for me a big inspiration, François Verger's text, Decolonizing the Museum. I think all of that leads to a certain kind of ask for a disorder and opacity, to go against that kind of, that there is one right way of for one place, but saying how can we, what is the method to create a museum where the community is informing the institution? And so I think what all of you said right now, I think is a teaching of, it's, you know, to go beyond, it's not about the object. And I think we're in a place where museums aren't about the objects we're collecting. And I think all of what we talk about with restitution or reparation, it is really also the stories the works tell, but also the people who come and what stories they see in them, and how can these stories, and therefore so beautiful to have Faustin's fantastic performance to lead into it, because the storytelling, I think, you know, can become a real inspiration even for a large-scale institution like the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. So this is really also an invitation to learn from you. What do you expect? Like, what could an institution in this place be, and how can we be a platform and a facilitator for artists, curators, other museums to partner and share knowledge, and also tell, I mean, of course, through the collection, we tell the story different. And I think we tell already a different story, because we are so many, like, there are so many different perspectives already within the DNA of this project, from like a very Western to the West Asian Emirati perspective. But the team, you will see when you see also our curators on the panels, we're just not, even for me, having worked in Australia, in England, in Germany, they were always like mainly Germans, mainly Australians, mainly English people. And now I'm in the team where there is no mainly anymore. And so it's an interesting starting point, I think, for an institution, and also a good point to really learn, because there isn't, of course, there is an existing structure we can take over. But I think what you're saying when you say, let's go away from the Western structure model, so that for the first time in my life, I feel there's actually maybe a chance to do that, because you start from the very beginning, and these seeds you put in, they might only become trees in 50 years, but it's the responsibility, I think, to be aware that it's not something which is going to happen in 2 years, but it will. It's an institution which I think has the chance to make a difference through conversation and relation and generosity of inviting other people in. And I think that's what, for me, also Abu Dhabi does, inviting so many different people in to participate in what the culture can be there.
What do we do now? Yeah, Salah or Aoun. Okay, so should I take some questions? Okay. That's what I mean. Okay, so we have Professor first come, and Professor Wole Soyinka to come in. We'll leave you the space so you can come and address this. So what do you think? Wait, it's your turn now. I will stay here. You come and join us. I will stay. Yeah. Okay. If you want to stay, you can stay. Okay. Yeah.
Well, let's begin.
Huh?
So when we have about 5 minutes left, I'll indicate to you by.
Okay. Well, please help us welcome Professor Wole Soyinka.
Thank you very much. The expositions which we've listened to up to in this brief intervention by the panel, for me, virtually capture the components, I will say, of the entity called the museum in many directions, both cultural, institutional, economic, of course, we heard about that, but also reminded me very much of the fact that when all these various properties are put together, we find that we have a choice whether a museum is supposed to continue, and I use that word deliberately because that was the tradition, continue the tradition of alienating or adopt what seems to be the most natural evolution, which is to invite and embrace. If we want very simplistic polarities of the function and the effects of museums on the people they are supposed to serve, that's a very simple axis along which to continue either the tradition of alienation, which sometimes go with elitism, specialization, mystification, or the openness in which the museum simply becomes part of an enlarged sense of community of history, of creativity, of inventiveness. When I came in this morning, I had a very remarkable kind of, it was almost like a series and then a fusion of flashes. There were two images on this, on these two screens, twin images. One, of course, the title of this conference, Towards a New Museum, Dynamic Museum. The other one, I'm not talking about that one with One Grain Monster, which also played for some time. No, I'm talking about the original second image, which was that of the Alps, so snow-covered mountains. And had a series of imagic flashes going through my mind. One was that I instantly recollected, simply because of the juxtaposition of the two images, that's all, because of the juxtaposition. I had a sudden flash of the artist. I haven't heard of him. There were two of them, in fact. I haven't heard of them for quite some couple of decades, I think, who took the art of installation literally to new heights, new dimensions. Most of you will remember them. I'm sure they're still very much around. And their technique, their material and motif was a wrapping up of objects. The wrapping up of objects. They looked at monuments, historic monuments, and then they became sort of upsellers, fastened all kind of gadgets onto these buildings, these monuments. In fact, the process itself was an artistic performance all on their own. But one of the most striking monuments which they wrapped up, in fact, possibly the first that struck world imagination, was the wrapping up of the Reichstag. And it took a while, had to get permission, etc. And then he had to assemble semi-mountaineers, which is why you understand now that mountain image, brought it back to my mind, who would climb up and then wrap up the entire building. And from that, from wrapping up monuments, they decided also to tackle mountains. I don't believe that they succeeded in carrying out that particular project, but they did commence it. And they were going to wrap up, I'm not sure it was Mount Everest or Kilimanjaro, I can't remember, but definitely they all said they wanted to wrap up this mountain. And these mountains will then become galleries, museums in themselves, objects of art, installation art. I recall recommending that they should, because remember, we are colonial creatures, and so we have a certain thing, payback mentality for our colonial masters. And I suggested that they should next wrap up the Buckingham Palace, because I come from British colonialism, and not only wrap them up, but leave them wrapped up for the next decade or two as standing museums for students of history to learn from. And through that, ideologies, etc., conflicts. I said, but wrap them up and let the public imagine what's going on inside. The little tinkling of silverware, whispers between the royal family, the feeding of those, what was that? Those their favorite dogs, the barking occasionally coming out of these structures. And I said, this would form the most mysterious, intriguing, and at the same time instructive museums that we ex-colonials could learn from, also have our sense of vengeance. So each time the word restitution came up in the discourse you had so far, my mind went to my Buckingham wrapped up image. Yes, that's where restitution should begin. But my mind also went to certain other museums I'd been to, even those which were museums in the making. Remember, I'm talking about the whole principle of alienation or embrace. And this was shortly after the liberation of, sometimes I get confused, there are all these human monsters. Ceausescu, what was this country again? Well, okay, and one of the huge follies of Ceausescu was this imitation Versailles. Huge, monstrous, exorbitant structure, which could, after the fall of Ceausescu, the new incoming government didn't even know what to do with this building, which was costing the nation, the newly liberated nation, almost all its entire budget in terms of just electricity bills, how much more the cleaning up and so on. And I was taken there as a special treat to see what had been going on in that particular area. The people used to, the citizens used to just drift through there. It became in itself a museum. They would drift through it and didn't know what to make of it. And so my hosts asked me, what do you think we should do with this? I said, I have no problem with that. I have several ideas. I said, but uppermost in my mind is turn it into a museum of horrors, a museum of the horrors of power. And I said, unfortunately, my own continent would have a lot of material to contribute to that museum. You wouldn't have to look at it. And from there, again, a series of flashes I was having as a result of just these two images. My mind then went from, of course, the Reichstag, through my own suggestion, Buckingham Palace, through this Palais de Folie of Ceausescu in Company. And I said, well, everything is being up to date, is being brought up to date. By coincidence, one of those, this conference is taking place at a very interesting time, very instructive time. almost as if the muses and the Orisha, that's the deities of my own society, as if they're now taking their turn to enjoy their restitution, their own phase of restitution from, shall we say, treacherous humanity, which has failed in so many directions, including the whole, continuity of the principle of creativity. I say we're being brought up to date. And so my next recommendation now would be to invite those artists back, the artists of wraparound installation, to take on the White House in America, following the recent event here. And for me, this is really adding dynamism, historic dynamism, to the principle of museums. We don't have very far to look if we really want to be original, dynamic. Let's see if we can get both the outgoing and new incoming incumbents to assist us to create a museum, shall we say, of suspension, shall we say, of a watershed, by wrapping up the White House, creating models, sort of mimic of the Reichstag. And we'll be able to present a museum in which history has truly come full circle. And there's a challenge for those who are really looking for a dynamic theme for a new museum. Totally original, and at the same time, narrative of the continuity of history. Let's put all these great models of these representations of the grotesque in the history of power. And this will be our young communities, the young societies, the young nations who are constantly waiting in the wings, in which we include, of course, a nation like Abu Dhabi, it's very young, almost sort of immediately post-colonial nation. And we can utilize from the histories of these structures, and of course the effort of the citizens who've been in one way or the other, shall we say, formed. The modern man is the expression. People prefer the modern, and I do too, the modern person. The people who've been formed will then be finally obtaining their historic and global restitution on the whole immensity and monstrosity of power. And we now have museums which truly narrate the history of liberation of humanity. So those are the ideas that came to me this morning as I came in, just 2 images alone. And so you can imagine what happens when you have a concertation of images, interplays, like the kind of performance which we witnessed this morning. There's no shortage at all of models, no shortage of themes. It's all a question of communicating, distributing, disseminating as widely as possible the existence and also the meaning, the ontology, and also the developmental visions of our age, of our society, and of our histories. I shall end with one of the ways I think this can be done. And this is what you might call the floating museum, the globally floating museum. I don't believe that we've ever had anything like that in history of museums. Oh, we've had expositions, especially during the contest of powers, the Berlin Exposition, British Exposition, French Exposition. We've also had what I call the dynamic nature of the museum exhibiting itself through even the transformation of those static museums. Like, look at the difference between Musée de l'Homme, for instance, and Musée Quai Branly, in which a totally new meaning is being given to the artifact. We're seeing artifacts more and more as creative objects, created objects, as opposed to anthropological data. This is quite a transformation over a couple of centuries. So it's only a question now of as I use the word dissemination, and more greater exposure. And this is where I come in with my pet subject. A few people here may have heard us talk about the reverse route. In America, they call it route. The reverse route of the of the slave experience of the African continent. That's the slave experience now. It's not talking about the humanity, no, that's too large. But we're talking about the despoliation of the human within a specific zone, which is for me one of the most quantitatively impressive and oppressive phenomenon in terms of unequal cultural exchanges. I mooted this just briefly in Venice, And the idea we've had, what we've been playing at and even experimenting with over the past decade or so has been a reverse track of the slave experience, in which a liner, a boat or whatever, or boats, a flotilla, would take place from the diaspora and reverse the journey of the African experience at the hands of the Western and sometimes even Oriental worlds. Just come back, stopping at the various ports, which have played a role, however minor, in that transmission, this grotesque rendering of the African experience across the Atlantic, across the Indian Ocean, and so on, and have a reverse journey. This time, however, as a statement of transformation, of liberation, and part restoration. And of the contents, the components of this boat, my favorite has always been that of a museum which narrates the history of the African continent. However, not once again taking what is left behind and putting it on the board. No, a museum of restoration, a gallery of restoration, restitution, beg your pardon, restitution. And on one side, we would have the Rogues Gallery, which would contain pictures, videos, models of the humanity of the African continent, which is, for me, the artworks, the creative work. These are the expressions, the manifestation, the precipitation of the humanity of any community, which is what museums are supposed to do. So we'll have, on the one hand, the Rogues Gallery, in which we narrate all that material expression of African humanity still held tightly by the outer world. On the other side, we'll have the Home of the Angels, in which we will exhibit models or even the actualities of those artifacts which have been returned to the African continent. And these will totally be the leitmotif of the decor of the boat, but in particular this gallery, which narrates that portion of the African humanity, which is still being kept in dungeons, or call them galleries if you like, but since they are stolen, they're being hidden, so that's why I use the expression dungeons. And on the other hand, to say to the rest of the world, well, this is what conscience has finally done. This is the commencement of a genuine restitution. This restitution can only begin by restoring the evidence, the material precipitate of one's humanity in its original forms. And these will constitute the beginning of floating museums, not just for the African continent, not for the African nations, not for the African history, but as an expression of an authentic exchange that stays simply one thing, that in the zone of creativity, all humanity is equal. Just as we say that too of all religions, we say that the very act of creativity is manifested partially, distortively, very often, with the spirit, shall we say, of the conqueror and the conquered, etc., that ultimately the spirit of creativity is one. So that's my advertisement for this project, which still keeps going on. And when the actual monuments are built, the design should reflect, I think, that instinct of the creative human that is common to us all and redresses history on a level and with a magnitude and quality that has only been partially expressed by that line of development that I mentioned earlier, from, shall we say, the Musée de l'Homme to the Cape Rondy to the Oviedo Museum, which actually was midwifed by Branly, and which is an expression of the direction in which the contemporary museum really should go. Thank you very much.
I was afraid, actually, with your third example, after Charles de Palace, was going to be the sculpture that you wrote so beautifully. Oh. But I'm glad you stayed away from that.
No, we'll talk about that later.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Soyinka is on this panel with Cette. Mr. Soyinka is on this panel with Cette, and then how.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello? 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 Hi, everyone. So we're going to start again, please, for the next panel titled on museums and relational approaches.
Hello, hello, hello. Can you please take your seat? Please take your seat. Or please take your seat. Or... Oui. C'est pas fini, il y a un dernier panel, après on va manger. Yeah. Can you please sit down? Please. Les jeunes, asseyez-vous. Mamadou, arrête de draguer. Mamadou. Sit down. Tell him to stop flirting. Yeah. Hello. Back there, please sit down. Oh my God. Let me see. Hello. Madame derrière, madame, arrêtez de parler, s'il vous plaît. S'il vous plaît, vous sortez, allez causer dehors. On a du travail, s'il vous plaît. Merci. So we begin the panel. Now, who's gonna, I can be here. You wanna go first this time? No. So, actually, I think Paolo Muyada should go first with your presentation. From Brazil, I met him. He was the curator of the São Paulo Biennale, and they invited me. That was the first time, but ever since I've been impressed by his work. I was just on a panel with him recently, but I was on Zoom, which was in Rio. So he's sharing some of those experiences with us. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mancha, and thank you for you all for being here. Thank you for the organizers, the leaderships, and the staff. I do have a presentation, but I also have a timer. So I'll try to summarize this in 10 minutes, and throughout the day and tomorrow we might develop if necessary. So the idea here is to tell you a little bit about this project that happened starting from a crisis. So the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro has been created in 1948. It's one of the leading modernizing institutions created in Brazil between the late 40s, early 50s. And it had a huge fire in 78, just when dictatorship was starting to end towards redemocratization. The museum lost more than half of its collection and was in ruins for quite a time. This is the Brancusi they had and how it got. And because of that, there were several demonstrations with Samba schools, art students, the progressist side of society that used to consider that museum not only as token of the modernization of art, but also as a place of democracy and freedom until dictatorship got really, really harsh and in a way created the crisis that led to the fire. And during these conversations, Mario Pedrosa, who is just in the middle here, was the most influential art critic from Brazil throughout the past century. He was part of the conversation, the demonstrations, etc. And he said, you know, we shouldn't just rebuild that museum. We should aim further. We should create the Museum of Origins. And what he had in mind was to bring together the Indigenous Museum, the Black People Museum, the Unconscious Museum, which was art done in psychiatric asylums, the Modern Art Museum, and the Popular Art Museum, all in the same structure, while maintaining each of them would have their curatorial staff, their collection, their audience, but they would reinforce each other. Since the Modern Art Museum was too elitist, the Indigenous Museum was always on the brink of being closed, and so they could lend each other their strengths, and they would be around what he called the Center for Creative and Experimental Activities that would bring them together. So what we understood looking at this project that at the time was completely ignored, artists just wanted space for experimentation, and the bourgeoisie wanted everything to stay the same, and dictatorship just wanted culture to end. So no one really cared for what Mario had in mind, but we, looking back at it, understood that it was not a retake on the myth of cultural racial democracy that is part of Brazilian folklore and history. It was actually a very different way of thinking that would consider that a museum could be a tool to reinforce several museums. One structure could reinforce, empower cultural institutions that Mario Pedrosa understood were key democratic tools for a redemocratizing country. So this organization would be a pool for exercising the right to authority. And it was very pioneer in the sense of understanding that there is a politics of memory, that what you decide to keep and how you decide to keep it and how those things bridge between themselves are in itself a politics that's help setting the priorities, the agendas, the protagonisms, and the communitary cycles in society. And when we started looking into the examples that Mario had in mind, we started seeing that those were some between several examples of politics of memory that have been done because and despite of Brazil, because of its richness, of the human richness of its people, but in spite of the lack of cultural policy, democracy, and so on and so forth. So what we did last year is that we organized this exhibition called essays or rehearsals towards the Origins Museum. And we gathered more than 20 places of memory across Brazil between we took what Mario had in mind and expanded it. So we went to the far north and to the far south of Brazil, between archaeological collections, ethnographic collection, popular, grassroots spaces, even botanical collections, of course, modern art, popular art, and art produced in mental hospitals, and so on and so forth. And we try to bring a metonymy, a section, an example of what those places take care, but most importantly, the history of each of these museums. Because the rehearsal of the Origins Museum was not the exhibition per se. Each of these places are a rehearsal of what an Origin Museum can be, because each of them grew up and stayed alive in Brazil through their commitment to their community, to their context, by fostering their own audiences and understanding themselves as sociopolitical tools that give shape to desires and to designs of how the country should be, even if each of them work with their own agenda and epistemology. So the show was a huge show between Instituto Tomiotake and Itaú Cultural, and it was kind of assemblaging those collections and histories. And I would just like to highlight, because Mancha brought this idea of the museum as a relational space, one of those 20-something cases, which is the Indigenous Museum, created in '53. Because it's a beautiful example on how a museum can rethink by necessity and by vocation their relational position in society. So when it was created in '53, idealized by Darcy Ribeiro, a great anthropologist, and he wanted to create this museum in Rio de Janeiro as a tool to advocate that indigenous communities were still alive and were very relevant culturally and as their own civilization. So, because in Brazil, this idea that we are the mix between the white, the black, and indigenous usually takes the indigenous to the past. So, oh, we have this indigenous history back in the days, but they were all died. Oh, it's such a pity. But Darcy was saying, no, they are alive. There are several indigenous communities, and they are alive now. So he wanted to make this museum in a global city that is Rio de Janeiro to show urban communities how rich indigenous cultures were. But then throughout dictatorship, from '60s to the '80s, the main relational role of that museum was that because the way it was created, they brought inside the museum all the paperwork that were proof of the indigenous land rights. So all the documentation that was scattered between several archives was gathered in the Museu do Índio. And because of that, it was not burned or destroyed throughout dictatorship. And this became a key documentation that even today helps preserving indigenous lands. Then later on, after the Constitution of '88, we got the law to acknowledge immaterial heritage. And the Museu of Indigenous People, with its scientists and researchers and communities, helped instrumentalizing this law and helped indigenous community to have their immaterial knowledge acknowledged. And then it became national heritage. And because it was national heritage, it had to be preserved. But how do you preserve a singing, a painting, a way of living? You have to preserve their ability to be alive. So they have to have land, because the way they live, they need their own land to fish and to organize, etc. So the heritage law became the new tool for sustaining indigenous lands, and the museum was giving the knowledge to the community to prove they had their own knowledge. So it changed it again. And today, these, among other collections, have been a key place for indigenous community to go and visit the collection and do a sort of reverse engineering in their own ancestors' production. So for instance, the Baniwa that have produced that ceramic on the right side, they went there to see how their ancestor used to paint, to reappropriate their own tradition that they now have resumed back in the Baniwa community in the north part of the Amazon River, the Amazon region, sorry. And my 10 minutes are gone, so we can talk about Glycella another time. Just to finish with this Glisson quote in the unpublished New River Trip notebook, where he says, "A writing without a project, neither a project nor a form, falsely punctual, that turns around its subject like a felock or the heave, a drifting felock turning around the morning shadows." So when we found this manuscript, we were in the middle of the process that we are now starting of looking to another dream of a museum that Glisson has fostered through his life. And we are hoping to bridge a little bit of what we have found out by looking through Mario Pedrosa's gaze, now looking through Glisson's gaze towards what a museum could be as a dynamic, nomadic, and relational space. Thank you.
Okay.
Director of the Institut du Tout Monde, and an artist and a doctor. She's my therapist. So my very good friend.
Okay.
You know, we haven't done something that I learned in Brazil, actually. The way you guys self-introduce yourself, the way, can you give us an example of that? That way, more people want to do it.
Yeah, so this is something we've learned with for accessibility purposes for people who may not have vision capabilities. So we start by saying, like, for instance, I'm a male with dark hair, dark beard, and glasses, with Asian features mixed with Portuguese features, wearing a suit and a gray shirt, yellow socks, and dark shoe.
So if you want to say anything about yourself before your talk, si tu as envie de dire qui tu es, voilà.
Okay, so I am not very fluid, and so I wrote my text in English, and so I'm going. I know it's not very nice, but I'm going to read it because I'm not comfortable to talk like you do. The idea of a museum for Edouard Glissant has always been tied to his vision of new poetics, the poetics of relation, restituting new landscapes to the world. I am very honored to be here today in the landscape of the vibrant African voices of Senegal, which had always been talking to Edouard Glissant, as you know, through his poetic. Edouard Glissant's vision of the museum starts first de son lieu in Martinique, where the river encounters the sea. And I remember here in Dakar that I still hear until now from my last visit of Ndar, who was the colonial name is Saint-Louis.
I still hear the battle of the waves of the ocean at the delta of the fleuve Senegal. So, you know, for Edouard, you know, the Martinique, his spot, son lieu, tout, he's aussi is a lieu from where hot springs coming from the depths of the volcano under the sea make alive the land. It is right here from this place that he imagined a living place where he could bring together artists whose works have multiple roots, works that are hybrid, and marked by encounters and diversity, creating a new global interconnection. For him, it was urgent to establish new common grounds, relinked all the landscapes and the archipelagos of the world, from the Americas to what he called the Africas, at the same time to the most faraway Pacific archipelagos, so tiny the island could be, like Rapa Nui, whose the colonial name is Easter Island. The restitution of the names is also an urgency too. To decolonize, we have to decolonize the names. In order maybe to liberate the space that we inhabit as a new space of exchange. This new space we inhabit as one who are now facing a world increasingly erecting new walls everywhere, retreating into closed system of imperial thoughts that self-generate themselves constantly, rejecting and destroying whatever they cannot use, and reducing everything to their own transparencies. The poetic of relation opens space to everyone's opacities, allowing the listening of their complexities, even if it doesn't understand them. It welcomes their presence. For Edouard Glissant, the museum is this place of premor thinking, a thought that allows a sensitive approach to the presence of all places and all voices of the world, a thought that listens to the world's tremors. For this reason, it is primarily an open space, a space to be traversed, an espace traversant, somewhat like the school he created in Martinique with no doors and windows, and no windows, where encounters can take place. He conceives the museum as a public and popular space where people speak and exchange, a space open to la parole, la palabre, certainement, very different from the traditional museums, often very silent and mute. It is a space of voices, a place of dialogue that summons all components of the imaginaries that shape reality, that generate the museum itself, which did not exist before la rencontre of everyone, of all of us, where the very structure of the museum is determined by the artwork themselves and the relationships they establish among themselves. He used to say, it is the artworks that create the museum rather than the museum creating the artworks. His vision was to create what he called a cloud museum, a rhizome museum, which expands as wide as the archipelagos, whose sa profondeur, is in the constant interconnection between its floating objects, between living traces and pathways across different temporalities, recognizing forms born from the fiction of tectonic plates of histories and consciousnesses, les consciences, about what he called archipelagic thought. He would say, they match the pace of our world. It adopts the, it adopts the ambiguous, the fragile to derived. It accepts the practice of detour, which is neither flight nor renunciation. Archipelagic thought, the thought of archipelagos, openness to these seas. Edouard Glissant's museum has been seen as a mangrove museum, as a metaphor describing these emergent, shifting zones where all components of life come to meet one another, creating new connection from which new forms emerge, giving birth to new organism. A museum as a new organism of the living. Edouard will often say, I hope in the parole, in the words of the landscapes. In truth, I think the museum for him was a new landscape that resists. It is both a Creole garden where plants and organisms nurture and protect each other through cohabitation with different species that settled here. And as a mangrove, which is both a place of birth of the living and also has developed the capacity to digest and convert the world toxicity and create new defenses and immune resistances. At once a place of repair and regeneration, the Mangrove Museum became one of the places of healing in a world that is often now coming defeated. Thinking of the museum in Africa today, I was struck by the exhibition of the Congolese workers' art cycle in the Netherlands pavilion at the present Venice Biennale, where they demonstrated how they performed a true ritual of exorcism on the colonial museum and its object it has imprisoned. The white cube, as they called it, settled in the middle of the original land from which they had been dispossessed. They recovered the ancestral gesture to found their own form of museum, their imaginaire, their talking objects, which are back to their landscape. And now, this talking object, tells les récits, their stories, of their long voyage through times and spaces. Their artworks showed in Venice had been created collectively. They are made with vegetal and earthen sculptures, made with a gesture of care, like healer. They are like healer applying poultice to wounds and stigmat of the scares and old injuries. In the pavilion space they inhabit, the sculptures seem to come alive under the visitor gaze, restituting the voices and the lost stories. Today, we continue to extend the museum to an emblematic space in Martinique, the actual house of Edouard Glissant. Now it's the museum as a house we inhabit too. We founded the Edouard Glissant Art Fund to create and develop the links between new generation of artists and Edouard's thoughts. It aims to first to support the Edouard Glissant Artist Residency in his house situated in Diamant, Martinique, which will be open from the world's visual artists, art curators and critics, writers, poets, and musicians. It aimed to promote also access to and disseminating of the Edouard Glissant Art Collection, a collection of about 200 artworks, mainly from artists bequests, including around 100 in the collection at the Memorial Act Museum in Pointe-à-Pitre in Guadeloupe, Caribbean. It aimed to also to encourage dialogue between new generation of artists and the writings of Edouard Glissant through support for international exhibition, publication, conferences, exchange, encouraging transdisciplinary research in this field, open to the worldwide students, researcher, doctoral, student, art, actor, curator, and depending on opportunities to the public. To conclude, I would say that at the end of the book of the Magnetic Earth, or the Wandering of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, which Edouard and I wrote together, the speaking stone says, in a tone of anger, but nothing is true. Everything is entirely alive. And the stone keeps repeating, nothing is true. Everything is alive. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. You just want to moderate. We're having the expert of Glissant sitting here, but he only wants to moderate. I gotta ask you a question. Thank you so much, Sylvie. This was fantastic. I can't wait to see the museum, the museum in Martinique, which sounds brilliant. I think I had the chance to talk a lot. What is interesting for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi in our thinking is really this, what you now call the Mangrove Museum, which is beautiful, because when I started to think about the relationship between the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi and Edouard Glissant's thinking, I was basically sitting within the mangroves in Abu Dhabi, and I was, like the research of Googling Edouard Glissant in mangroves, and not much is coming up. You always go back to the rhizomatic thinking. So it's now you kind of made, and then I started to read Aurélie Ferry, and she, in her book about the Caribbean poets, women poets, who actually makes that connection. And then now it comes back when I obviously spoke to Manzia, and now also you bringing it much more together, this idea of also I mean, obviously the rhizomatic thinking, the archaeologic, but also the mangroves as a place of resilience. And I think a place of where in our case, the sea and the desert, the kind of creating this transition. And I think for cultural institutions right now, it is a place where, you know, kinship and gathering is key. And also what Marie-Hélène said about, you know, how do you start with the community? I mean, that is, for us, it's really helpful to work with that metaphor of imagining the mangroves and all the, like the birds, the butterflies, the fish, but also the people in these mangroves and how they were used to protect, to hide, but at the same time, of course, it's a place of beauty. So cultural institutions, so when you talk about the Mangrove Museum, I think a lot what can be achieved with an institution is said in that. And the other beautiful thing you just said is the birth of a new organism. And so what we have started to think about for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi is like to think about the museum as an organism, and what does it actually mean also about the structure and the processes in the institution, and how can you make it work, knowing that, you know, whoever had a back problem knows that your pinky finger hurts when you pick up something. So the connection that every person in an institution participates in this organism, and that the hierarchies of, you know, existing structures have to be changed, and also the relationship between the institution and the audience, and how is that possible, right? I mean, but that's exactly what you're saying, that in this giving birth to organisms and ecosystems, how does that integrate also non-human species, but also how can we set up processes where it's not about the own agendas, but understanding that it is a larger picture of an institution where you participate as a part, and that an institution should be a facilitator for many different people. But that, I think, is something we're very invested in to just think through. Not that we have an answer. It's easier, I think, with building a new structure than trying to change an existing one. But it's definitely something, I think, that thinking about an organism, which I think is very important. And I think I mean, Wole Soyinka did it so beautiful. Using these images, I really believe that like images and metaphors help us to think what it actually means to build museums on the ground of these images, and not of like monuments or buildings, but that what's in there. But I think I might hand over to our
just a quick kind of maybe a response or a reflection on also things that were discussed earlier today, right? And I was kind of picking up on some of these recurring phrases that seem to also connect the conversation. Sylvie, you brought up floating objects. Wole Soyinka brought up the floating museum. And I just wanted to kind of reflect on this a little bit, because I was also reading the text that Mancia and Terry have so beautifully translated and put together. And there is a moment in the text by Glisson, and if you just permit me to read it out for everyone here. And then there is a continental reality that is coming out of the idea of systems and systematic thinking, which compels us to deduce one truth out of another. And then there is the archipelagic world, which is different from the continental one, that we are discovering more and more. We are coming into a consciousness that archipelagos are more important in the movement of contemporary structures of feeling. And I just wanted to maybe speak through two anecdotes. Anecdotes that, first one I have experienced myself, and the second that has been narrated to me by an artist. And the first is going back to discussion around feeling of structures of feeling, and the archipelago. Many years ago, my partner Leila, who is here also, we were wandering across the world's largest archipelago, known to us as Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. And as we were kind of on this boat, it was a regular boat, nothing fancy, not a yacht or anything like that, just a regular wooden boat. We suddenly see all around us is just water, but one tree and one man standing in the water. And so we get closer and closer to this man. And of course, as we approach this man, we are kind of wondering, why is this man standing in the middle of the sea and with this lonely tree? And as I get closer to him and kind of enter into there was discussion around the anthropological and what do we do with the anthropological today? We ask him, what are you doing here? Why are you standing here? And rather than being annoyed or being confused, he began to laugh and laugh quite loudly. And then he said to us that, don't you know about tanah air? Tanah air in Bahasa, in Indonesian means, tanah means land, air means water. That you are in land and water. There is no difference here. It is the same. What are you talking about? And I immediately realized that I think when we think about grand terms like museums or even curating, we tend to forget, and this is what the Glisson text kind of reminds me, that there is a difference between what we know and what we think we know. And we're constantly trying to bridge this, and probably we will never bridge it, I feel, but it's worth an aspiration. So that's the first anecdote that I wanted to offer. This man standing with a tree in the middle of the sea. The second anecdote is one of language, because language has come up, especially with someone like Wole Soyinka and the power of language and words. And there is this great anecdote, something that happens in 1964. So the Malaysian painter, poet Latif Mohidin, who is also a very dear friend, finds himself in Berlin. And he's wandering about. He's a young man who kind of speaks the German language, but he's having this kind of, what do you call it, culture shock sometimes, this culture of the new. And he's wondering about the ethnological museums in Dahlem, which is where Germany stored all its ethnographic objects. It's kind of a suburb of Berlin in a way, of West Berlin at the time, because the wall was going up the same year, the Berlin Wall. And he encounters these, what appears to be Thai, Khmer or Cambodian, or perhaps Indonesian, Malaysian objects. And he notices this word that is associated, the German word that is associated to it, pagoden. And he remembers this word and he comes back to his room in the cold and begins to write it down, like obsessively, pagoden, 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 pagoden. And he realizes then that actually the German word comes from the Sanskritic word pagoda, right? Pagoda is the shape of any temple, any Buddhist temple that you would see all around the world. And I asked him years later, a whole body of paintings and poetry and everything came out of it. But I asked him years later, I said, what happened? Why would you write these things and make sketches constantly? And he said, well, because I had to find a way to dress the word up for the occasion. These are his words, dressing the word up for the occasion. And what he did was he dropped the den, the suffix, and the da, and created an entirely new word called pago pago, which then became a way for him to try and understand what is the space of these objects in these museums. And I asked him, should these objects ever be returned? And he said, it doesn't matter because the word has already come back. So word has been sent that these objects exist and they have been sent in a renewed form. So what went back has returned, but something entirely different has returned. It is just a word, pago pago. So I just wanted to sort of offer these quick anecdotes, I suppose, to try and also think a little bit about these questions around Glisson and how there is a strongly experiential dimension attached to this, right? That you can actually be in the archipelago, you know? So I love to kind of hear more as a question. I think we have some fantastic experts here on the panel. And I had one question for Paolo as well, which is, in a way, Paolo, what does it mean to return to this idea from the 70s today, right? Is there any contradictions in this process, right? To return and to create something that was described in perhaps a earlier time, a different time, maybe even a different political moment. So just to ask this question, yeah.
Well, I think if we could go back to when Mancha introduced in a previous session, he mentioned about how most of our structures were built to preserve beautifulness as some sort of Western model of how things should look like and how the upper or more valuable things look like, look, behave. It's the whole aesthesis of it. And then there is this bow, this beauty. There is something that is more on the moment, more unruly, that appears in spite of everything, in spite of the same power that is willing to kill it or to reshape it and make it beautiful, or at least livable with. And in that case, I think people like Glisson, like Pedrosa, they were, by their writing, by their intellectual and direct actions, trying to find ways of preserving this beauty, finding ways of preserving, or I don't know if preserving is the best word, but of empowering this beauty in spite of everything. And of course, they lost the battle because it was a battle that was meant to be lost. And right now, today in this world, it feels we are still going to lose a lot of battles. But we should try to look to our aching spirits, like to other people that at once try to find them. And what we realized by borrowing Pedrosa's glance was that there are so many, we are talking about new museums, but there are so many old museums that were built by families, by communities, by villages, by indigenous tribes, by grassroots young people somewhere in some suburb that are in themselves what we have been talking about for the whole day. But what they do not have is any way of continuing, of assuring that their battle will be continuous, that it will live on after that one woman, one family, one guy dies or collapses or can't stand anymore. So we felt that what Pedrosa had dreamed about is still not in place and is still very much necessary. And we are sharing, we have been talking, Mancha, Sylvie, for the past months or so, that also the museum that Glisson dreamed about is still not in place, and it's still very much necessary in the sense that we are still, we still have yet to visualize a museum that can empower the tour as to take the tour as the common language, to take the multilingualism as the common ground and build on top of that.
Yeah, no, I actually, thank you for going back to the earlier panels, because many words, recurring themes came up, whether it is, with Diba talking about reappropriation, in addition to, of course, the words that were raised by Babacar Mbaye on restitution, repatriation. I think those recurring themes of floating museum, they actually are in Glissant and Wole himself in a way. The word dynamic, if we were to go back to that, because I think that Babacar Mbaye kept defending it, brings in the idea of museums as processes. So therefore, picking something up today that was done in the 70s, you bring in this Glissantian idea of open totality. So Senghor's museum, I don't want to say alienating, the people did not get it, but it has created something that was there for the second generation to get it, for the generation after that to add something to it. So it keep building it. The process never really stopped. I think that idea of process is quite important. And Glissant talked about this. I think Sylvie mentioned the common grounds, the idea of common ground. Glissant, in French, the word is lieu commun, but the way he kind of sneakily, as he liked to, he was always playing also, not only a poet, but always playing. He puts a hyphen between lieu and common. So common, between common and ground. And by doing that, you're not only playing with African American, with a hyphen, this 70s and 80s phenomenon that started, but you're also talking about place, how places are connected and how these connections actually brings in two ideas. One is that you're connecting differences. As you connect differences, you're also making a point that there is in relationality that Sylvie is talking about, that I teach a class at NYU called Poetics of Difference and Equality. How you posit equality between differences. It's not because one is small and one is big that the big one become more important, or one is primal. I think you mentioned that there are no primal objects. Somebody mentioned that at some point in today. So it's not like I arrived here first and you just arrived, that you are more American than I am. So that this difference and equality is very important to Glissant, and apply to museums. Then knowledge becomes something, le savoir grandit en voyageant. So not only there is the idea of relay like in the Olympics, where you have I run, I give you the torch, you run, you give it to somebody else. For Glissant, he used that motif to say, that's how knowledge travels. If it leaves my hand and goes into your hand, it gets bigger, it gets different, it goes to another person's hand. And museums can be seen like that too. So I think this morning, many of these ideas keep coming, and I could use Wole Soyinka's, also the two books that I try to mention, the Burden of Memory and the Muse of Forgiveness. They have word reparation several times, word restitution, word reconciliation, because he wrote the book thinking about South Africa. Reconciliation keep coming in. This morning, reconciliation, how can art and healing also keeps coming up. How can we think about museums in those terms? Yes, so I thank you for your question, for kind of going back and what is the significance of 70s and then going back to that now and how that brings in process. I don't know if somebody else would do. Je parlais en français.
Non, ça va.
Ça va?
Non, tu dis tout ce qui est
Tu as tout
important.
dit.
Oui, tu dis tout ce qui est important, donc ça va.
Elle a tout dit.
Non, tu as tout dit.
Do we still have time? Yeah. So I mean, most of it maybe might be interesting to think about museum and kind of that connection, you know, you made through what does it mean then for a museum, you know, the question of language which came up, and I think the different languages which have to be present and how that can be thought through.
Maybe just to say that I think the place of language, at least within museums today, is becoming much more critical. Something that was taken for granted, for a long time, because the emphasis was always on the visual as a phenomenon, the visual as an experience, the visual as an asset that can be traded, the visual also as a form of transcendence. But I think language never left the museum, but I think has become increasingly critical. And I just wanted to say that I think the older vocabularies that we inherit, and there was a lot of discussion around this today morning, right? Especially with the keynote, as it reminded us, there is a lot of older vocabularies that we have inherited. But I actually don't think that we should be kind of taking all of that out entirely. My position is a little bit more sympathetic to the older vocabularies, because I mean, there's this joke that I always made that I speak no European languages, for instance, you know, and here I am speaking in English. So what does that mean? So I think to not take out everything that was inherited, but to say that a lot of these terms are in need of quite immediate and actually urgent revision, right? How do you revise this? Who is your key collaborator in this? Is it the poet? Is it the storyteller, as the performance today reminded us? I was quite struck by the introduction that I'm a storyteller. I'm not an artist per se. The word artist was actually not used at all. The word storyteller was used. So who is our collaborator now, at least within the museum? This is a grand question, I think, Stephanie, that it's worth asking in relation to, I think, what we try to do, also, like, who is that collaborator and what form does this collaborator now take? Yeah.
I think right now, the artists are the poets, are mainly, I think it's very sensible, I think it changed a lot, if you see the installation, you can see that when I went to the Biennale Venice, I could see poetic installation and the words, and it was like full of poetic words, poems, like it was, and I think I was very impressed by this new movement to the, yes, by the artist, yes.
But Glissant is challenging. It's interesting that Sylvie said this. Glissant actually is challenging biology, physics, political science to be poetic, talking about storytelling. If it's not poetic, I'm not interested in it. You do physics or biology if it's based on certainty, rationality, logic, systematic systems. It's not that interesting. but physics have to be poetic. And when you talk to physicists, they agree with a lot of this. Political science, again. So yeah, I think the idea of poetry actually, or storytelling in this case, because the stories that we saw with Faustin Lignacula today was impressive. It was moving. There are times where you feel like you want to have tears, but there are times where you wait for him to say something, so you are trembling with his trembling, which is a cliché in glissant. Trembler avec le tremblement des autres, because you don't know yourself, let alone pretend to know the other person. So the best way to know that person is to tremble with that person, but also tremble with objects, tremble with animals, and so on. So trembling is very important, and I think Faustin was creating a lot of that in the performance, that whole poetics of tremblement. But the idea everything has to speak in poetic terms, and if it's poetic, then it speaks in all languages. He said he recites his poems in front of Spanish people, in front of Zulus, but of course, Glissant, this is a guy who spoke perfect English, but he refused to speak English. He only spoke in French. And then he said, but when I speak, I think I've succeeded in provoking him only one time. And he said, around two concepts, imagination and imaginaire. And we had a translator who was exhausted in using the word, exchanging them. So at some point where Glissant wanted it to be imaginaire, the translator said, imagination. And Glissant said, non, ce n'est pas ça, c'est pas la même chose. with imagination, he can write a novel. He can draw a figure. With the imaginaire, he can only write a poem. He said, I don't know if you remember that, at the NYU, he said that to us one time, so yeah.
Sorry, just maybe to add, the same way Glissant would point towards poetic gestures, poetic flows as a way of using a force that is at the same time before and beyond the certainty of the categories, of the strategies, of the epistemologies, of Western knowledge, of the encyclopedic knowledge. And that's why he loved the artists and the poets and so on. But I think to take Glissant seriously, because he's not only saying that we should evaluate everything else that is not Western, he's also pointing towards this myth of Western knowledge and Western institutions as something that is so solid, so coherent, and so pure, and saying we cannot just say that the other things are valuable, we must prove them that this is a myth, that this is broken, that this is a fiction. And we have to go and show that it was also made out of errance, of detour, of multilingualism, of multi-ethnicities, and so on and so forth throughout history. But at some point, someone edited this out. So I think maybe we should, or we could, looking or moved by Glissant, also imagine not only that the museum is something that houses poetic expressions, but also something that is developed in an essayistic way, as an essay. So when we think about essay as a poetic form of thought, we could also think of an essayistic way of building collections, putting up exhibitions, curating, writing, and meeting up with communities and between each other.
Thank you. Thank you very much. To all of you for sharing these thoughts and stories. I think that we will miss a lot if we don't hear about Glyceria Tupinamba and the story of the Tupinamba mantle. So it would be great if Paolo, you could speak about it a little bit. And I actually wanted to ask a question to Stephanie. In our panel before, we were talking about, you know, like this idea of creating a museum from scratch. And I understood also that in the conversation, there was this desire to kind of share thoughts, ideas. And I thought maybe it would be great if you could tell us more about the seed idea of the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. So not in terms of the invitation to do it, but more in terms of what's the proposition? What's the seed proposition? And also what is the approach to collecting? Is there a collection that would be part of it? And, you know, how would you approach that in that space? Thank you.
So maybe most of you want to talk a bit about the collection. We have the panel also tomorrow where we talk a bit about that. So the invitation, for me, the seed is the invitation. I mean, it was an invitation which was given in 2008, so a long time ago. And the collection started in 2008. So the seed of this collaboration is to do it together, which, you know, is, I mean, we all know this phrase, if you want to go fast, go by yourself. If you want to go together, it goes slow. And I think that has been the history of this project. So many different brilliant people have built this collection on the basis of a focus of the region and a kind of, you know, if you go through the kind of history of the project from transcultural to transnational. So it was always about that in the seeds. I mean, with us coming in now, we're really thinking, even if it was in there, it was never talked about in the sense of relational or using the metaphors also because, I mean, from 2008 to now, it's a long time. And it's interesting to go into it because the seeds of collecting, which was for many years the core activity of the institution, because there were like so many other things to be considered in relation to the building. While now I think we're in a time with also us as a team where we say the collection, of course, is core, but the museum is, the collection is just one part. And, you know, but the exhibitions are one part, but the tissue in between is what we're growing, the community, the relationship, the sense of belonging. So a lot of what we're talking about and using Glissant, but obviously we know that many brilliant thinkers are thinking around how can we create these relations and how can the institution, so the mangroves for us are also, as you've seen on this map, a kind of image to say, we have the clear constellations or relations to institutions like New York or Bilbao, and we have the cultural district, which is on the island we are. But for us, it's really important to build the relations to also places where the mangroves are very present. So the so-called also global south. I mean, there are many other, but that's what we are building. I mean, maybe Mustafa wants to talk a bit about the I mean, the collection is something which is built far before us, and we're kind of working with it. But I think we can maybe say we massage it as a growing team.
Thank you for the question. I mean, I can add a little bit more to this. I think to say that perhaps the entire question around collections and especially curators working with collections is that at least today that we are entering into a kind of a terrain of a simultaneous comparability, but also an incomparability, because there is a kind of an ongoing debate. No, can you place this object next to this or not? And if not, why? If yes, how? right? And I think at least within the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, the collection allows for this to happen. Whether it is for the better or for the worse, this is something that we have to really navigate through very carefully, curatorially. I think this is the kind of curatorial challenge in working with this collection, because the collection is incredibly diverse, built by incredible groups of curators and thinkers in their own right, who have kind of authored it at various moments in this rather long journey, which has been about 15 years. I mean, the collection has been built over the past 15 to 16 years. So it carries some of these questions. And I think just to go back to the metaphor of the seeds, I mean, this is the possibility, no? There was this great quote that was going around on social media recently, and I thought it was very apt, which when something like, I'll try my best, they tried to bury us, but they didn't realize that we were seeds. No, so I think this is sort of the possibility here, and the promise, if I want to be very optimistic, but also the challenge, right? So to be aware that we are entering into a state which is a double bind, as I said, that you can compare, but how, right? This is the big challenge, I think. And this is also connected to how the collection is also built around regions and regional thinking. And in a way, regionality, at least for the last 20 years or so, as it has evolved in the discourse, has been really around questions around what is the place of the region in relation to larger global forces. And the region has been a site of resistance for that. But I think increasingly now, also as art historical discourse catches up, I guess, if you want to call it that. It's not a nice thing to say about art history, but it has always lagged 3 steps behind curatorial work and artistic work, obviously, and maybe there's a reason for that. But I think as art history catches up, what happens when you can actually see the horizon, right? Do you turn away from it? So I think museums generally are facing this, and Abu Dhabi will also face this as a challenge. So it's just, what I'm saying here is that to work with this collection is to be aware of the challenges that it presents. And maybe these are not challenges that are specific to the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, but I think generally institutional work or curators operating in institutional context have to ask these questions increasingly. And maybe Guggenheim Abu Dhabi's collection, because it has been built in a way from the last 15 years, allows for us to engage with these questions in a critical and, I would say, careful manner, I think, to be respectful, I think, also to the art that has been entrusted, right, to the collection.
No, she asked to talk about Visalia, but I don't think there's a 2-minute version of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the 3-minute version is that Glicelia Tupinambá is a young Tupinambá woman from Serra do Padeiro in Bahia, an indigenous woman who grew up with her community. And in a way, she was educated through land right struggle. So her family and people fought for their land, and she grew community knowledge, political knowledge, and so on. But then when she was having classes at some point in a normal school, she saw the Tupinambá Cape depiction for the first time. The Tupinambá Capes were very, very important, beautiful artifacts that were traded or robbed or acquired throughout colonization and sent to European museums in Denmark, France, so on. And none of them was preserved in Brazil. So it was considered a lost ritual aspect of the Tupinambá life. So we have Tupinambá communities, but not the craft to make them. But then she saw that and she said, this is mine, this is speaking to me. And she kept thinking about it. And eventually she went to France to a seminary or something, and she went to Pr collection and saw what Tupinambá came in front of her, and it talked back to her, just as the performance told us. It talked to her, and when she was, she would sing and have dreams, so on, and in a way the cape asked her to bring him back, to bring it back. So she went back to her community, started talking with her ancestors, with the shamans, with her aunt, and looking how the Tupinambás still make the fishing nets, how they make the hammocks, and the way. So, and then she got another opportunity and went and saw all the Tupinambá capes that are scattered throughout Europe, and she reverse engineered it. So between dreams, conversations with ancestors, and access to European museums, she rebuilt the process to do Tupinambá capes. So people will ask, Célia, do you want the Tupinambá cape to be restituted to Brazil? And she said, you know, let them take care of them. After all this time, that's not the real thing. It's the real thing. It's my ancestor, but now they should preserve them. They are super fragile. Take care of them. What I want is not to restore the object per se, is the spiritual, ritualistic craft of making it. And she did so. And today the Tupinambás have their new, they don't have the same colors because the birds change it and so on, but they have their new capes and the shamans are using them and they have their own agency. And in the middle of this process, the first Tupinambá cape ended up being given back from Denmark to Rio de Janeiro. So she didn't even was asking for that, but in a way, it spiritually or politically or culturally, it sparkled something and Denmark decided to give it back. And now we have one 17th century cape in Brazil, along with the 5 new capes that Glycelia produced. And Glycelia is one of the brightest, most beautiful and charming and intelligent person in this planet, I would say, but in Brazil, I'm sure.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for that. We're going to break for lunch now, and then we'll be back for the last panel that begins at 3:45 p.m. here. So yeah, thank you. The 2 lunch options is Cafe Lulu and then Radisson Blue Hotel, right?
Very good options.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're the most closest ones.
Yeah,
You
they're the
take a taxi. Is it easy to get a taxi out here for people or
Yeah.
it's fairly?
But I think it was better if you play with the public too. Like you did.
As an asking question.
Yeah.
Where do we go?